Welcome to NewYorkBIO's Virtual Breakfast Series, a digital program created in 2020 bringing you fireside chats with leaders from across the healthcare spectrum. This week's episode features Jen Horonjeff, founder and CEO of the Savvy Cooperative and a driving force behind bringing the voice of the patient into the innovation spectrum.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Jennifer Hawks-Bland, and I am the CEO at NewYorkBIO. Welcome to our virtual breakfast series where everyone is now used to the normal of bringing your own coffee instead of us gathering somewhere in Manhattan and providing it for you. We're thrilled to continue welcoming our outstanding guests today. So now I feel like it's old hat. New York is open for business, unless you happen to be traveling from 31 states across the country, in which case you can come, but you just have to quarantine. So we're dealing with all that as far as New Yorkers. And then at the federal level, certainly the president issued a series of executive orders on Friday aimed at what he believes will be activities that will lower drug prices. We'll see more information of those roll out and look for communications from NewYorkBIO as we both assess them and the impact on patients and our ability to make life-saving medicines that will continue to be able to be paid for. So with that, I'll turn it over to Derek to introduce our esteemed guests today, and then we'll get going. Thanks so much.
All right. Good morning. I'd like to introduce everybody to Jen Horonjeff. Jen, good morning, and thanks so much for joining us today.
It's my pleasure. Thanks so much for having me.
All right. So before we kick off and you get to tell a little bit about where you came from, you have been all over the webinar circuit in terms of delivering the message for the Savvy Cooperative. Do you know what number webinar this is that you've been on this morning? Have you kept account?
That's a really good question. To answer exactly that, this is my first webinar of the morning, but I know that's not what you're asking.
Yeah, you Derek.
I know.
She did.
And that's even without coffee. So thank you very much. I don't know. I'm still humbled that people think I have something, to share. And so I'm excited to be here with you all.
Okay, great. Well, can you tell us a little bit about a little bit of the background and the origin story? So you formed the Savvy Cooperative. You have created and popularized the Ask Patients hashtag, and have really been one of the driving forces around getting the patient voice and the patient experience really into the innovation spectrum. And we had met really briefly at the Unheard event out in JP Morgan, and really it was one of the times I actually I saw this arc. I saw the types of things that you were talking about. I saw more and more about what you're doing on social media, and the patient experience has become, I think, a much bigger topic throughout really everything we've seen over the last year. So, could you tell us a little bit about, really how you got where you are? How did you get into this, and a little bit more about Savvy?
Sure. Well, I never meant to be here. I didn't think that this was my life path in this particular way, but I always start my sort of story with the fact that I am a patient. I always identify with that first. I was diagnosed as an infant with juvenile idiopathic arthritis, along with, I have 5 other autoimmune conditions, both rare and common. I had a brain tumor removed 7.5 years ago. Still not there, although my neurosurgery appointment has now been rescheduled 4 times this year. So, we'll see. but so that's it. Like, I very much identify as a patient, was very involved in patient communities. Truthfully, I thought I was going to go into medicine. I was that kid that thought I was going to be a doctor. But I was actually a little disenchanted from going into medicine because I saw the limitations that my providers could actually even practice the medicine that they wanted to because of the way our system works. So I was like, maybe there's another way. So I first became a human factors engineer and human-centered designer in healthcare. I then went on to get my PhD in environmental medicine, which is really loaded. I was studying patient-centered outcomes. What else affects somebody's health and health behaviors outside of just the clinical markers or the things that we're traditionally measuring? How do we make sure that we measure things that matter to patients so that when we do this, magical shared decision-making down the line, that we actually have the data that they need to make those decisions? I also served as an FDA advisor for many years. And so I kind of had my hands in a lot of different cookie jars. So I had these different vantage points. And with that, what I heard my professional colleagues talking about did not align with what I heard the patient communities I was a part of talking about. And, these were the professional side, wonderful, well-meaning people that wanted to make better products, services, innovations. They just didn't have all the information that they needed. And since I'm very open about all of my health conditions, that people would say, hey, Jen, will you be that patient rep on this project or that committee? And at first I was flattered to do so. But when they kept coming back to me, it really signaled a diversity issue. If you can tell, I am white and I have a PhD and I live in New York City. So therefore I cannot possibly be representative of all the people with my condition, especially like with arthritis that affects 54 million Americans. I'm one person. So I said, let's try to go talk to other people. And so when I would get these requests, I would say, okay, hang on, let me go to my community. And I would just post this to my Facebook or other places. And I was flooded by other patients that wanted to contribute. They just never had any way of knowing that these opportunities existed, let alone a way to connect with the two sides. So that was my sort of aha moment was, okay, we can solve this problem. We just need a platform to be able to connect the two sides. So it's so easy and seamless that there's no excuse for these companies to not be able to connect with patients. And we really set out to do it as a disease agnostic platform, because that's what oftentimes we're all held in these little silos. I'm more than just an arthritis patient. I have so many other conditions. And I could speak, as a caregiver, if I had a spouse with cancer or a parent with Parkinson's or a child with asthma. So we wanted to make it a place that we could have sort of a one-stop shop to sort of create best practices for working with patients. So that was sort of the origin story of Savvy.
Okay, so, and your co-founder also, I don't know if he has exactly a similar story, but is also, a driving voice in cystic fibrosis. And,
Right.
how did you guys meet? How did the co-founder team come together?
So Ronnie Sharp is my co-founder, fabulous. He's our COO, and he has cystic fibrosis. And while we have similar journeys, they're actually kind of like the opposite in the fact that he grew up with CF, and then he created an online social network for people with CF. So he was very community focused, is where he kind of started his journey. And he saw sort of the same things that I was talking about, that I kept getting asked sort of to be that patient rep. And so for him, once he built this community of rare disease patients, you can imagine that everybody then wanted them. So he could see that, this happened. And so we had originally met at a PCORI meeting. For people who aren't familiar with PCORI, Patient Centered Outcomes Research Institute, I don't know, years ago, and kind of kept in touch because we were sort of like, the analog of the other person within their community. We were doing a lot of work in what's known as transition from pediatric to adult care, since we both grew up in pediatric care. And we were even working with like sort of the same like team of consultants. And so when I had approached them and was telling them about Savvy, and I guess I didn't even touch upon the fact that it's a co-op, so I should dig in a little bit there, but the co-op is very different. And when I was telling these other consultants about kind of this model that I was starting this company, they're like, you should go talk to Ronnie. I'm like, I know Ronnie. And he was thinking the same thing, because as a co-op, what it means is that our members actually can have ownership in the company. So we're not a 501c3, we're not an LLC, we're not a C Corp, we are a co-op. There's no drop-down menu for that. So I spent a lot of my time explaining co-ops. and what it means is that patients have a vote in our own organization, and that we then are able to share our profits back to them. So a co-op is a for-profit company that redistributes its profits to its members. And that was something that just fundamentally, as I thought about, the kind of business that we do, that we could be making money from it, but it didn't feel right for me to be profiting off of my fellow patients and peers doing the work, sharing their insights and their time and expertise. And so that's where Ronnie and I really bonded, was saying, let's give away our company. So it's not every founder that wants to give away their company's equity from day one, but that was how we approached it.
Yeah, usually the math works in different ways on that one. So was there a point where it either started as an experiment and then you knew it was real? Was there kind of a validating moment where you said, well, if we can do this, then we can keep going and we can actually build it the way that we want to?
It's a good point, and an interesting question. I guess in my life, I just have never really had a plan B. So you just like really lean into plan A and make it work. That's probably my stubborn chronic illness personality, that I'm always out to prove people wrong. So I think when it comes to whether or not this would work, we just kept going. I mean, I can't tell you, I used to joke, if I had a nickel for every time people said, don't be a co-op, that we wouldn't have fundraised in the first place, because we spent all of our time just trying to say, like, you know, we haven't shown that we can't do it. And so that was my whole thing when people said, like, it's going to be so hard. I'm like, I don't mind hard, but let's just figure out that it doesn't work, and then we could talk about something else. But I rather really put a stake in the ground that there is a more equitable way to work with patients. And that's what, you know, without actually even explaining what Savvy does, is we connect those innovators with patients for the purposes of doing things like user experience research, market research, getting patients giving input onto clinical research, protocols, design, feasibility, all of these things. We want you to actually ask patients and talk to them. And so thinking about what do we do as a service, we help to make sure patients have a voice, and we make sure that they're equitably valued, that they're compensated fairly for when they're working with companies. So it's kind of hard to stand on a soapbox and say, you should do those things, but we're not going to do it ourselves. So that's why the co-op model matches perfectly with what we do, is that patients have a voice in our organization and we equitably value their contribution. So so that's what we really were like, full steam ahead.
And Savvy is definitely probably one of, if not the only co-op within sort of the healthcare space, is it?
Yes, I mean, that's something that's really unique about us. We're the first and only patient-owned. We're also a public benefit company. So we're a public benefit co-op. It's a mouthful of awesomeness. So that's what we're kind of starting this experiment. We're not the only co-op out there that's trying this sort of new model. We're one of these, what's known as a platform co-op, is how can we take these century-old models of cooperatives and apply them to today's like tech platforms. So there are co-ops out there that are essentially driver-owned Ubers, or like host-owned Airbnbs. So anything where you think about this like platform, it's like, well, what if the people that are actually the ones that are generating, you know, the value had a stake in the company? And so that's what we're doing.
It really is interesting, because I grew up, and those of you who know me, I grew up on a farm, right? And so that's where my dad, we were part of a co-op, and that's where we purchased seed and, you know, and different, you know, things you use, fertilizer, things you used on the farm, but certainly not a technology driven co-op connection of patients. How do your patients find you?
I mean, it's a great question there. We have a really interesting model. I mean, the first patients came along because they knew us. I mean, we've been in the advocacy space forever. And so that's where, you know, kind of like our communities came along with us. But that's where our model, and even how we actually do our job better than sort of, you know, traditional patient recruitment models, is because we have this network of our co-op members. They then go into their communities and pull in new and more diverse participants. So when we have an opportunity, so let's say a pharma company wants to interview 20 patients with breast cancer, and they have all these specific inclusion exclusion criteria. We put that opportunity out to our, you know, current mailing list, but then our members are able to take that and bring it into their closed networks or their, you know, church groups or whatever it might be, in whatever culturally sensitive ways that make sense to them, and share those opportunities. And so with that, about every opportunity that we have, about 70% of the people who apply are new to us. And that's something we're really proud of and really important to us, because we want to continue to have more and more diverse individuals participate in these opportunities. So you're not talking to the same people over and over again, which, if you remember, is why we started Savvy in the first place. And so that's what we have, this pull model that our members are the ones driving. So that's why we want to value their contributions, because they're the ones that are helping to keep this going.
Right. You want to have the, you want to have a network pull where people, you know, keep bringing in other people into the fold, right? And it's interesting because from a typical, you know, from a typical company creation model, it stands the logic on its head, right? The general story is you have this founding team and they have the equity in the company, and, you know, things go all big, and then you have a few people with ownership, et cetera. And this is basically, if people keep joining, your ownership pool keeps getting larger. It's not really all that indifferent to a public company in some senses, where if patients want to be a part of it, they can be, right? It's something that can keep growing on itself.
And the difference between that is that With a co-op, it's one member, one vote. So economics and governance are separated in that sense, because it's not whoever has the most money and owns the most shares has the most voice and the most power. So here, everybody's vote counts the same, but the way that we value people's contributions, if over the course of the year, you know, I do one survey, but, you know, Jen, if you do 3 surveys and 5 focus groups and you recruit 10 new members, you will get a larger share of our profits at the end of the year, but our votes count the same. And so that's the way a co-op works.
Do you have a situation where patients are coming in to you and saying, we have this particular condition or disease state, and we want to give feedback to this company? Have you had it be reversed yet?
Where patients want to give,
where you go to the company and say, we have a group of patients and they really would like to give you input for, you know, this, that you clearly work in this disease area.
Yes, we have actually done that, where, you know, we have sort of like this critical mass of patients. That's what, you know, and interestingly enough, we do really well in rare disease. And that's because of our model. So that's why when companies say like, well, how big is your patient panel, or how many of these patients? We're like, that's not how we work. I can say this because we have a case study with Bayer. Bayer had come to us with a super ultra rare disease, and they said, hey, if you could find us one person to talk to, that would be a win. But because of our model, we put that out to our network, and we had a patient that had a similar-ish condition. They're like, well, let me reach out. And they did, and they over-enrolled that gig in less than 2 days, but they were looking to talk to about 15 people. But it's just because it's this more authentic peer-to-peer model, so that it's not like, you know, market research firm knocking on like a closed Facebook group. It's like a patient says, hey, I'm part of this, you know, patient co-op Savvy. We have this opportunity, wanted to tell you about it. And so it's just more authentic. And so that's what, again, when we get those sort of core groups of patients, we also have, this is the beauty of a co-op, right? You have a little bit more of like that collective bargaining, where you can go and say, hey, we have a really engaged group here, and they would love to be able to communicate with you.
Yeah, there's a little bit more trust involved when people know where you're coming from, right? So we don't do this terribly often, but we had a participant raise her hand, and Esther Dyson, who, you know, has been an investor for ages and you know, created the Way to Wellville, raised her hand and wanted to ask a question. So I'm going to allow her to talk here. One sec. Good morning, Esther. How you doing?
Hi. Okay. Sorry. I'm glad you don't put me on video, because I'm actually on the rowing machine right now. Good morning, Jen.
Hey, Esther.
It's great to see you. And forgive me, I joined a bit late, but you know, how do you reach? What are the demographics of your community? How do you reach beyond, you know, the sort of white male college students? And I totally know you do, but I'm just curious to hear a few more details. Thank you.
Yeah, and that's where, you know, we do it several ways. And so one thing that I had discussed was around sort of our members going and pulling in their own communities. And so that we're able to reach those diverse participants. And what you note too, and I know something that you care deeply about that diversity and the diversity of those communities, is understanding sort of that culturally sensitive way of approaching those communities. That's what, like, I'm not going to be the one that knows how to go into, you know, a rural Black community in the South in an appropriate way. I'm here to support, but that's what we really are trying to empower our members to have what they need to go into those communities and pull people in. We then also partner with other, you know, advocacy or community-based organizations, so that we have those relationships. But you know, I've grown up in sort of patient advocacy and worked with those organizations for many years, and they have a time and a place and are, you know, serve really important roles, but their focus isn't always on helping to connect those individual patients with these opportunities. And so that's what we can partner with them to be able to connect, you know, those individuals. Same thing with like those community-based organizations. We love working with them, sort of the small, scrappy, grassroots ones, because they're so connected to their members, which is what we like to think that we are as well. And they see it as a way of adding more value, especially during these economic times. Again, we make sure that patients are compensated for their time. And so it's just another sort of like value add to them. So it's something that we don't claim to be perfect at, that we continue to grow and want to, you know, have more people involved with pulling more people in. We're about to actually kind of do our own sort of census, where we are able to kind of describe our community better, because we know people care about that. truthfully, we haven't asked a lot of that information when people just sign up to be part of our like mailing list, because we want to keep it very frictionless. And that, you know, when we started this years ago, we thought that asking people too many questions could certainly be sort of a turnoff. But I'll also say that for each opportunity that we post, you know, that focus group or those interviews or user testing, there's a screener involved so that we can make sure that we find the right patient at the right time. Like, what are those eligibility criteria? And also to make sure we have a representative sample. And so, you know, it might not be like a binary, you're in or you're out, but we want to make sure, okay, we have this many men, women, non-binary, this many people from different race or ethnicities, this kind of geographic representation. So we get that screening criteria in and then work with the client to say, okay, here's what we have. Who do you think you'd like to talk to from this mix?
Speaking of geographic, do you have patients? Because clearly, like we've talked a lot about the different ethnicities and gender, but do you have patients that are all over the country or the world? Or, I mean, what's your?
So yes, we are, you know, worldwide. However, we're strongest in North America, certainly strongest in the US. We have a lot of European clients. I mean, a lot of our pharma clients are European, but because the US market is so important to them, oftentimes their work is here in the US. So it's really based on client pull. Like I said, we don't necessarily we do zero marketing. And so our whole model has been around patients pulling, like, you know, bringing their own communities in. So that's the way it's been. So if you think back to like, what is the chain of events? The company says, this is what we want and who we need. And then we put that request out and then we go find them. And so, you know, you can also think about all the places where there's a lot of hot innovation. We've definitely worked in those areas then because our clients have already built those communities. So we do more work now in Europe. We have partners there as well. We keep getting requests to expand to Asia. We are not strong there. We would not be the right partner at this time. You know, starting to expand more into Australia and those markets. But I would say, again, it's based on requests. And so if it's outside the US, we just tell people honestly, like, we can support this or we can't.
Yeah. Which is totally fair, right?
Yeah. We like to think so. I mean, again, as a co-op, we're nothing but transparent, if anything else.
So who are the major, you know, do you work really across kind of the healthcare spectrum? Do you work with biopharma companies, providers, hospitals, really everything in between?
Yeah, although I would say we kind of think about that we're doing a lot of work in sort of three major buckets, that being like pharma, biotech, digital therapeutics, all of that. Then sort of the digital health bucket as well. So that's from startups to the large tech companies that are getting into healthcare. So we work with all of those. And then we kind of lump everybody else into sort of that third party vendor is sort of our other really big client. So that's the design agencies, marketing agencies, you know, UX designers, market research firms, everybody that management consultants, everybody that is working on behalf of their client. So we do a lot of work with them because, and even those other patient recruitment companies that have sort of their stagnant patient panel, they are also our clients because they come to us because they can't find the diversity that they need within their sort of panel. So those are kind of the three major buckets. You know, with health systems and payers, we do some work with as well, but I think that they have been a little less readily excited to or thoughtful about understanding that even though they have access to patients, that it doesn't mean that they're getting the insights that they need, nor are they understanding people outside of their current networks. Like, wouldn't you want to understand how you can attract more people to your system, to your plan, et cetera? So we're starting to work a little bit more with them, but I think it's, you know, sometimes they're like, well, we have patients, but, you know, you're not actually engaging them. Like having a PFAC at a patient and family advisory committee at a hospital is not representative. It's not getting you the full insights that you need. So, you know, we're starting to see more and more interest there as well.
Yeah, that historically has been even more transactional than the patient-physician therapeutic relationship.
Yeah.
Yep. Esther actually threw in another question into the Q&A, which have you had a lot of discussions around, you know, how hospitals or other providers treat patients versus, you know, uses of therapeutics? You know, both therapeutic and non-therapeutic administrative ways to treat people.
I mean, I think that we are getting more interest into like looking at sort of those protocols, those treatment plans. I mean, that's some of my background was like redoing treatment guidelines so to make sure that they include patient preferences, because I think that that is the problem, is that there are different priorities. And obviously we're seeing, I just listened to a podcast on my walk this morning about like the difference in incentives and why, you know, certain patients right now are being treated in private hospitals versus public hospitals during the pandemic and all of this. So I think that a lot of it comes down to incentive alignment, but I think that that is one of the things that we need to, you know, keep part of the conversation.
We have a question from the audience from Dell Lavelle at Regeneron, and they obviously do a lot of work in patient advocacy as well. Have you thought about leveraging your members or the patient voice to raise awareness about access issues or health disparities in the legislative or public affairs advocacy?
It's a great point. We just got roped into, or looped into, I won't say roped into, discussions, I should pick my words carefully, discussions around telehealth. And what we decided even right now is that like, we are not a lobbying group. And so right now that is not our focus. So we actually are not looking to kind of push that through. But it's something that's interesting, right? Like as a cooperative, we certainly see with this sort of bargaining power someday, if we can be, you know, quite big, that there's a lot of things that we could do, especially where we are disease agnostic. So we're looking at ways of supporting. And so when I say that we've been looped into some of these conversations, it's trying to figure out what is that balance and how can we supply patients or testimonials or things that can go support those people who are doing the lobbying, but that we are kind of the support system there. So that's kind of where we are at right now with sort of affecting policy at this juncture.
Yeah.
Okay, so so one of the other things that we wanted to chat about here, what are some of the things that organizations typically just get wrong, and some of the things maybe they get right because they've quote unquote always done it that way, right? What are the places where convention has just utterly failed in the ability to connect with patients and get a more patient-centric solution to things?
Oh my goodness, how much time do we have left? All right,
plenty of time.
Let's dig in here. I mean, I think, well, so I've been in and around this space for some time, right? And what I kind of feel is that for maybe the past decade, people have been talking about being patient-centered. And that was nice at first to sort of, you know, proclaim that you're going to be a patient-centered organization, which part of me is like, what is a not, like, why in the world would you not be? So it's weird that we have to say that, and we all understand that it kind of doesn't mean anything. But now it's kind of like, well, what actions are you taking? Like, you can't just talk about it. You had a decade of grace period. So now it's like, actually prove it. And what I find, because we work with all these different sort of pharma companies and other companies, but I like to call out the pharma ones, because I find that there is this spectrum of sort of risk aversion to when it comes to talking to patients. And we sort of internally joke about those that are like innovation forward, and those are sort of like innovation proof. And those innovation proof ones are the ones that are just like so rigid on how they think they're allowed to work with patients. And this is tough, right? I want to give some grace here, because I know that the FDA, while they say like patient engagement, we need to do it, they stop short of actually giving any sort of, you know, guidelines or guardrails about doing this. And so that's where sort of the ones that are on one end of the spectrum, they're so confused, they don't know how to do it. And so that's where we try to do some education and provide more resources and you know, success stories and use cases, and people are coming around. But I think that part of it is just, you know, the model has worked to make a lot of money, and let's just be honest about that, you know, it's hard to try to change courses, even for like social responsibility reasons, if what you had kind of worked. And so we need to sort of reset. And I'm hopeful that certain things that are happening right now around the conversations around social justice and, you know, the pandemic displacing people from a health equity standpoint, that we will actually stop and think about this. One thing that I will call out, I mean, again, I kind of joke too that I'm not a business person by background, so sometimes you shouldn't take my business advice, but things do need to have a bottom line. And so we need to understand that. And so through that lens, one of the biggest issues that I find is that the people who are the champions for this kind of work are not the people with budgets. And that is a problem. That like, if you have sort of a chief patient officer that's supposed to be there looking over things, but they don't have an actual budget, and they're like, oh, it's up to the individual brand teams or things like this, well then that's where we get challenged around these kind of things. And then, you know, I've worked with pharma companies. I had a conversation a couple days ago where it was our contact there was worried about some legal and compliance issues around like, can we talk to patients and like do consent forms and all that? But then they talked to compliance and they said, oh yeah, this isn't a problem. And so I don't want to like put the blame on any one type of role. And especially every pharma company has a different org tree. They're all structured differently. So there's no real way of knowing like who the decision makers are in this kind of stuff. But that's one of the things that I see the most of is, you know, not knowing where to get started, not knowing where the budgets are, and then just sort of that fear factor of, can we actually talk to patients? And that's where I think like, if you're just asking about unmet needs, that is not off-label marketing. That is, you know, you're not trying to do anything like sneaky or shady or get them to sign up for your clinical trial. It's just trying to have an authentic relationship with the people that you're trying to serve.
Yeah, and historically, I mean, as a recovering litigator, I also recognize on, you know, the other side of that the stakes are very large for companies that do misstep in that area. So they definitely want to make sure they're being very careful. We actually had a question from our audience asking, does your group, do you ever get involved in having a disease recognized? Because I know you do a lot of work with rare disease patients.
It's a good question. We've actually been asked about whether or not we would turn into like a registry someday where we can, you know, track all these things and then go, you know, we're still young in our journey. So from that end, I would say that that's not what we're set out to do. That's not what we have sort of the infrastructure to do right now, but it is something that we find very fascinating. As we collect more and more data, we'll be able to look at some of these things, but at this juncture, no, we haven't been working in that space. Well, I will say that we sometimes get clients that are asking for a certain set of symptoms. And so it's not necessarily even a diagnosed condition, but they're looking for some of that because they want to know. And especially in the rare disease space, we've been asked to do things to look for people with a certain diagnosis because they know that what they're looking for is oftentimes misdiagnosed as that condition. So sometimes they're like backtracking. They want to talk to these people that then maybe have some funky other, you know, things that are happening. Yeah. And then they want to go talk to them and try to understand. Again, just from an understanding standpoint, not from like a clinical trial recruitment standpoint, but just to try to dig in. So I would say, you know, in that regard, maybe obliquely, we are in that space.
Yeah.
So there was another question too that I think follows on with this line of discussion, which is how do you address HIPAA and GDPR compliance by your affiliate organizations?
That's a good question. And so, you know, I think part of these things, when it comes to HIPAA, you know, people are familiar with it, and I'm sure your folks listening in here are very savvy about that. But, you know, a lot of the time people don't necessarily understand like what HIPAA is actually trying to do and what the requirements are. But for us, the information that we get about patients is self-reported. And so while, you know, we make sure that all the technology that we use is either HIPAA compliant or has, you know, the appropriate security standards, we ourselves are not required because of the source of the data. We don't ever get a doctor sending us a patient's health record. That's not how we work. And then GDPR, of course, we have to be GDPR compliant. So all of that, you know, we have to think about those things. In terms of other organizations that we work with, I mean, really for us, we're more supported by the infrastructure of other like technology companies, the other SaaS providers or things that we use. But again, all of that we are very cognizant of and have, you know, a lot of scrutiny into what kind of providers we use from that standpoint. But our other like, you know, advocacy organizations or partners or things like this, you know, we have different kinds of relationships with them and just make sure that everything is above board when we do our work with them.
Yeah, we actually we had a question from Lou De Janeiro, who is the CEO of the Leukemia and Lymphoma Society, who says, you know, how do you work with patient advocacy groups? What are some of the main things that you do with them?
Yeah, well, that's what, you know, again, I stated patient advocacy organizations serve a very important role to do things like programs, policy, education, you know, all of these things that we don't do that stuff. And so that's what, you know, our background, knowing that they don't always have sort of this infrastructure and support to be able to do these requests. Even this morning, I woke up with one of our partner organizations, one of the advocacy groups, that they will even refer clients who reach out to them to us so that we can handle all this, because this is what we do day to day, the contracts, the everything. And then we work with that organization for the recruitment, because, you know, we're going to make money off of that recruitment. And so we share that with the advocacy organization that we work with. So we handle, I mean, hey, we like to be equitable. And so that's what we have in place, is that, you know, a company comes to us if we're going to partner with a group to kind of source those patients, that we then, you know, give them a cut, because that's only fair. So that's the way that we typically work with them, but we get to take on the burden, the fun burden of all the contracts and everything like that.
But if you do have a patient that, for example, wants to not only give their personal story to the R&D work, right, to that side of the house, but maybe they have a calling to be out front in public and a public advocacy face, then that's probably a nice match with the advocacy organization, because they can really use those talents as they talk to policymakers.
And that's something that, you know, we really want to be doing, that sort of, you know, symbiotic exchange, because we don't do those programs and policies. And that's what, again, both myself and Ronnie grew up in these advocacy organizations that really made us into these sort of outspoken representatives that we are. And so we want people to find those, because again, we don't do any disease specific resources or education. Like, we have this little sliver that we have carved out for ourselves. So we want to funnel people to those sort of vetted organizations to go find, you know, other resources and opportunities to be able to, you know, get more involved. So yes, we definitely want to be sort of cross promoting there.
Okay, do you do any work with either, you know, accelerators or kind of any of the incubators that house a lot of startups?
We do, and I'll throw in there also with investors, because all of them with these startup companies, and everybody wants those companies to succeed. And I want to point out, like, nobody wants them to succeed more than patients. And so therefore we want to find a way to help them. This is one of the big issues that we've seen, is that unless things have like a high enough price tag, other like companies maybe like ourselves wouldn't take them on. And we think this is a huge disservice to patients, that, you know, then all this money is being pumped into these startups that are going to fail because they don't have the right insights. They're not finding the right product market fit. And so we do work with those accelerators, incubators. Sometimes we're working directly with them, and they're kind of, you know, have a contract with us to help their portfolio companies. Sometimes it's that, like, we're a preferred vendor that those startup companies can kind of tap into for different sort of discounts or things that we're offering for them. And with investors, you know, we help them even with like diligence to make sure that this is something that company or that patients actually want on the market, to sort of do some work there, but then also to be sort of like that preferred vendor to help those portfolio companies continue, especially if we think about startups and sort of using that lean iterative design model. We want to make sure that they're constantly testing those hypotheses with patients. And so that's why we try to make it really easy and seamless to continue to get that feedback. So yes, we do a lot of work with them.
You know, it's funny, we spent a lot of the early part of the call thinking about your business model and how things are non-traditional, but, you know, then you went and raised a venture round somehow, which, you know, as you noted, is probably the first cooperative to ever get venture funding, let alone in healthcare, right? So what was that process like? Did you think about raising venture money? Did the venture firm come to you? How did that start, and what did that look like?
So I will also note that this is a non-traditional venture capital type raise. And so NDVC was our investor, which is part of OATV, venture capital firm, and which is, I know, a little bit confusing to explain. But I think, like, what is our venture story? Well, again, level set that I did not come from like an MBA background. So I had the naivete to think that a cooperative was a viable business to grow and become scalable. So I had a little bit there that kept me going. Although again, I was told by my venture friends along the way, like, are you sure? But it just was like, we haven't seen that this hasn't worked. And so it was something that was on like the back of our mind. Truthfully, we had a lot of like early interest as well from other VCs that would reach out, and I would kind of say like, look, you don't want to invest in us, we're a co-op, just because knowing the kind of like models that they had,
Yeah.
but they kept coming. And so we were like, all right, let's see what this could look like. And I won't name names, but we had one very well-known VC that's known for sort of these scalable platforms come and want to really explore this. And we went, you know, the whole way looking at what this would look like. And what it came down to was really thinking about the governance aspect of it.
Mm-hmm.
That's where we could figure out the economics. But when it came down to governance, they were honest about it. They're like, we don't know how to be on a board with I don't want to say non-investors, because of course there can be, you know, non-investors on a board,
Mm-hmm.
but thinking about the fact that our members actually have representation on the board, that they can vote for representation
Right.
there, that they just weren't sure if they would have enough sophistication to make these sort of strategic business decisions. And that's where things kind of fell apart. So in doing so, what's interesting is that that is actually how we got introduced to IndieVC, to Bryce. Even before that fell apart, it was like an early sort of like, oh, you should go talk to Bryce. And so Bryce Roberts at IndieVC, he and I had met years ago. And I think I was somewhat taken to hearing about his journey, who had made, you know, even institutional seed investments, you know, more sexy and mainstream, and then did that with IndieVC uses more of a revenue-based, I know he doesn't like calling it revenue-based financing, but a revenue-based like risk equity type funding model. And so it was really interesting to me to think about making a model that's been around forever, but making it more mainstream. Part of that was like what aligned with this investor in particular was, you know, I think there's a lot to learn, because we want to make this cooperative model something that becomes more mainstream, that other companies can use and learn from. And so, you know, the other thing too is that for them, they need to see that companies have revenue, and that's what we've been able to make revenue since day one, where we're not just like a tech platform that's just, you know, burning through a lot of cash and going to figure out a business model later. And so, you know, we had enough revenue and we had known each other. I remember one of my venture friends had said that his partner that he worked with used to say that we invest in lines, not dots. And that always stuck with me and made me think like, well, he had already seen our progress, and so had seen that this is something that's actually working. And so that's where ultimately it ended up working out. What was interesting about that is that IndieVC actually does not want any governance, that they don't want any voting rights. And so what we had to do as a cooperative, which is so fundamental against a cooperative principle of having votes, we had to create a series of shares that did not have voting rights.
Yeah.
And so we had to take that out. And so here's something else that I'm really proud of with our cooperative. To do that, we had to amend our bylaws. And to do that, we had to have our members vote on it.
Yes.
And I'm not gonna lie, I was a little nervous. Not that I think it wouldn't pass, but I was like, this is the moment that all those VCs were telling me like couldn't be done, right? Like your members aren't going to be smart enough to be able to do this. So we, you know, educated the members, we put the vote out, and we used the software, and I would like refresh the link, and I can't know who votes what, but I would just like want to see like how.
But you would see the number, and you knew the number you had to hit, right?
I know, exactly. And so, but then I was really excited because I actually knew it was about to happen, that we got that vote passed in less than 24 hours. Wow. And we have hundreds and hundreds of members. Yes. And so I was so excited about this because it wasn't just important for that investment. It is something that we can now point back to say that any co-op really could point to us and say, look, Savvy was able to do this in less than 24 hours. You can no longer say that like a large co-op that is not in one place, we didn't have like, you know, a meeting in person to discuss these things and have an in-person vote, but we were able to collectively educate our members and to get that vote out, and that they were responsive enough to get that vote done, and we passed it in less than a day. And so that was really exciting to be able to do that and to get this first cooperative venture back. So it was very exciting.
How did you answer the exit question?
Oh,
right? How
that's
did
a
it,
good question.
where does their return on the equity come from?
Yeah, so that's what, it's part of their model. And so in this case, the model is that we actually buy back their shares through our revenue, a percentage of our revenue. And
Okay.
so that's the model that they have, so that we don't have to have a sale or an IPO in order for them to make their money back.
Yeah, that's really smart. That's really
It's
smart. I
very,
like
it's
that a
very
lot.
co-op friendly. Yeah, and that's the whole thing. Like between that and the fact that we retain voting rights, it's trusting either the founders and their traditional model or the membership to know what's best for the organization. And we actually have regular calls, so we certainly look to them for guidance, but they're never going to say you have to do this, you have to sell, you have to change your privacy policies so we can extract more data. That's in our hands.
Yeah, it's funny you mentioned not having an MBA. Honestly, if you wrote down all of the things that you did for this company and put them into a case, no business school would ever teach it. They'd be like, this doesn't happen. No,
well,
there's
hey,
there's
no
way this
be,
could be inexplicable.
we
case.
have like some of the big business schools that are coming to us to do those case studies, because it is weird. So we look forward to that day.
I could see the title of the case is like, wait, you did what? A
Yeah,
discussion of
it's
how
like,
to build a patient
don't do
cooperative.
this. Yeah, head scratcher.
So can we talk a little bit about COVID and just in some of the thinking around, number one, it'd be interesting to know if you guys have been pulled into anything specific about either the response to COVID or how people are actually trying to adapt in the face of the virus.
Yes, and I think at the very beginning, we even just put out to our members, like, what do you want our response to be? Because I think that's where I felt this sort of tension as like a disease agnostic, patient cooperative, like we have an opportunity here to figure out the best way forward. So we even started to do some early work just describing the issues. So we put out even a report early on, having patients or our membership in general, they don't always have to be patients, to let us know like what kind of different accommodations they were making. One of the things that we found too is around sort of their stress and anxiety early on, that 74% had ranked that they were, higher stress or anxiety than they usually are. So just to be able to describe the problem first. And then what we saw was more and more requests to even rethink sort of treatment protocols. And we've done a lot around clinical trials, because people are trying to figure out how do they revamp and have a decentralized or virtual trial. And so we don't want them rushing into those things without talking to patients. I think that's one of the big issues, especially around things like digital or telehealth or whatnot. We throw a bunch of technology or whatever the service is at patients and say like, yay, we solved the problem, but we haven't stopped to think about whether or not we're actually now overburdening the patient, because we've now given them all these new tasks that probably don't even talk to each other. And so it can become a big challenge for the patient. So we've done a lot around looking at, protocol design and feasibility. What are new digital endpoints that are going to be looked at, or the outcomes that patients would be looking for, as well as things have to be, kind of revamped. So we've been doing a lot in that space. We've even, both but also our members have served as judges for innovation challenges. We do a lot more of this kind of work, having patient representatives there, looking at some of these different innovations that are being put forward at hackathons or things like this. So we just really have like a very nimble response. We were doing a lot to work with companies to even just make sure they were continuing to get patient insights. We were doing a lot of, discounts, saying like, look, we're going to waive our fees. Essentially, we just want you to pay patients, and we want to help you even with like budget freezes and all of that. Like, you need to get patient insights now even more than ever. So make sure that you're continuing to go and get those patient touch points. So we were working with companies during kind of that slump where things were just kind of at a standstill. So I think that there's been a renewed interest in making sure that we're understanding these new insights that patients have, given the fact that the world has changed. I will also say something that I want to stick around after the pandemic is getting virtual insights. This is something that Savvy's been preaching from the beginning, because we believe it's more equitable. It's a better way to get more diverse people and have more inclusive innovations if we can talk to people virtually in the middle of the country, wherever it is. I mean, so much of this innovation happens like in an in-person workshop in San Francisco, New York, and Boston.
Right.
And that's it. So
that's not, and patients are all over.
Exactly. And it's also hard for people to take off Tuesday at 2 p.m. to come into a focus group. And so this has really opened up new opportunities to have these sort of virtual engagements. We actually, during the pandemic, we launched a virtual patient insights platform to help even collect some of these insights virtually so that you can do your focus groups, your discussion boards, your surveys, all of that. So now we can sort of be the one-stop shop for those things. So I think that there's a lot more that will continue to roll out, unfortunately, as the pandemic sticks around.
So one of the things that I was going to ask about is geographic disparity in the input you were getting from your patients in response to COVID. But I actually would flip that now. So do you do kind of outbound distribution of either best practices or learnings to your patients and your members? Because if we think about it and we think back when the country only had a few hotspots of the virus, it was very different in San Francisco and New York than it was in, say, Kansas, right? And people in Kansas could very reasonably be thinking, what is the big deal? I don't know anybody that's sick and it's not here. Why is this something that's of concern to me?
Yeah, and that's where I think, especially the early reporting that we did around collecting some of the data for, what were people experiencing, what kind of accommodations, and, collecting sort of where were they in the country, we started to see some of those aspects come to light. We also had launched a campaign that is sort of in its revamp at this point called Viral Voices, but you're welcome to go and check out that at viralvoices.com, where we were collecting stories from patients that they were sharing that in the regions that they were in. Truthfully, we're revamping this now to look at what does it look like to really not just focus on the pandemic, but just health equity and social justice as well, because that's obviously tied in and a huge issue that we need to address. But those we were also looking at by region so that people could start to understand and build this sort of empathy to what other people were going through, to hear the real stories. That was what we were learning at the beginning, is just a bunch of statistics. How many people are hospitalized? How many people have died? How many people have it? And that doesn't tell us a lot. But when you start to hear some of these stories that we were hearing about homelessness, addiction, lack of access to care, and even things like I wasn't able to take my vacation and I feel guilty that I'm upset that I couldn't go to wine country, like people wrestling with these different things. It's very human that I think we're all doing right now. So just kind of elevating those stories, since that's what Savvy really is all about.
Yeah.
It did. I want to flip back one comment. Stu, you're talking about the clinical trials, and obviously some clinical trials went to rescue mode. Others were planning ahead. Are you seeing companies come to you and your patients not only to talk about rescue, or they were probably in like April and May, but like now planning ahead for clinical trials that will start this fall? How do they look, and how can they be more patient focused given the restrictions on movement we have these days?
Yeah, absolutely. And you're exactly right. Like early on, it was like crisis mode. How do we just like band-aid this and figure out how to keep these trials going? I'll also say that I had a lot of people come to me and say, do patients even want clinical trials to continue? And we asked our members, and it's a resounding yes. They want more therapy. So they want these to continue, but they want to be safe. I mean, it's something that Ronnie, my partner, is in a clinical trial himself, and he was worried about like supply chains. How is he going to get access to this medication that, like, look, I'm a believer in clinical trials, even just on him alone, because I have seen his life absolutely change from being in this clinical trial. So I want to know how he's going to get his medication. And so it's really, really important. But now you're right. Like, we need to kind of probably scrap a lot of the protocols that were already designed and start to rethink them and rethink those tools. Even things about, where the innovator side is like, oh, we'll just send a phlebotomist to them. And does that patient group feel comfortable if they're high risk or whatever it is on letting a phlebotomist into their house? And so there's just a lot of things to try to think about. I talked to one patient who, it wasn't even about a clinical trial, but she was talking about how she had to almost come up with her own protocol with her aide that was coming in to give her infusions, because the home health aide didn't have access to any PPE, and this was here in New York. So she had to beg, steal, and borrow PPE from other healthcare workers that she knew to be able to, here's what you're going to do. You're going to come in, you're going to take your shoes off, you're going to go, you're going to wash your hands, I'm going to leave a mask and gloves for you over there, then I'm going to be sitting in my chair over here, and you're going to come, and all these different things, but it was up to the patient to do. And so that's what we're taking, those insights from what the patients are even already doing, and helping to educate those that are in the trial space to understand like what's the comfort level and what are the different kinds of things that are feasible.
Yeah, it's when human factors and patient-centric design meet an antiquated protocol design.
Yes.
You know, and
So
it's
these
one
are
of
my
those
favorite
things
things
that,
to solve.
yeah, no, they're fun, and honestly, it's a lot of it is where, you know, it's those kind of challenges that, you know, as soon as you step, you know, into the future, those are the things that you have to solve because you're not doing it the same way that you had before. So, you know, we have about 5 minutes left. So I think if we could talk a little bit about the future, right? So where do you see all of this going? Is there are we going to be redefining really the way that everyone kind of talks to and interacts with patients, right? You said there was about a 10-year grace period, if you will, about being patient centric, but do you see really the impetus for companies to genuinely start to, you know, put their money and their efforts where their mouth was 10 years ago?
I think so. And honestly, I think that's the only way for companies to survive, is that those that are going to be doing it right and doing the work are going to be the ones that patients are going to want to use. I mean, we even see this, you know, my space in the rheumatology autoimmune space, a lot around biologics and thinking even about like mode of administration of infusion or injections or all of this kind of stuff, and like which ones hurt less, which ones the patients talk, they know what's going on.
Right.
And so they know which companies are actually putting in the work to develop these, you know, better experiences. And while I still think that it's tricky if we call patients consumers for a lot of the reasons that, you know, have been talked about before, you don't have the same kind of choices, yet there are elements that we should think about. The fact that patients are savvy, which is why we are what we are, and so that they're going to be able to sort of compare things in different ways. They have certain expectations around, you know, how they get either medications or services, apps, all of these kind of things. So that's why I think that the companies that are going to provide the best experience are the ones that are doing the work. It's just that simple.
Yeah.
Well, that's fantastic. Go ahead, Jennifer.
I was gonna say, yeah. So thank you. We are almost out of time. This has been fascinating. Truly. Thank you so much, Jen, for your insights. And we will remember to always hashtag ask patients and encourage our member companies that are developing therapeutics to also ask patients as they develop their treatments. Thank you for being our guest today. And thank you to Goodwin for being our sponsor. And we hope you have a great rest of your Tuesday.
Yep. Thank you so much. Thanks everybody for joining us. We've got a great lineup coming up in the next few weeks. We're going to talk vaccines next week with Chris Earle. Then we have Glenn DeVries, who's the CEO of Medidata, on the 11th. And Peter Kolchinsky from RA Capital is going to come on the 18th of August. Thanks so much to everybody for joining us. And we'll sign off. Have a great day, everybody.
Bye. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you for tuning in to NewYorkBIO's virtual breakfast series. Join us every Tuesday at 9 a.m. for more discussions with leaders from across the healthcare spectrum. For more information on NewYorkBIO, please visit us at www.newyorkbio.org.